Chapter 24. Two black SUVs drove down the street in convoy, the only vehicles moving along the stretch of middle-class, suburban neighborhood. They didn't stand out very much. The casual observer would glance up at them for a brief moment and not give them a moment's attention. The windows were heavily opaque, so nobody on the outside could see in. If they had been able to, however, anyone would have had quite a shock at the sight of the heavily armed occupants inside. Knowles sat in the front passenger seat and cradled his HKG-36 to his chest. He pulled back the cocking lever and checked chamber for what must have been the 100th time. Once again, as every other time before, there was a round chambered, and the magazine was secured tightly into the rifle. He sat nervously inside the car, sweating slightly underneath the black tactical gear, and small rivulets rolled down from his temples beneath the Kevlar helmet. That prick Coleman and his other associates were pissed off for what they'd seen as his failure incompetence, was the word they'd barely restrained themselves from saying, although Knowles recognized Sarah Connor's trick with the vagrant for what it was. A brilliant piece of deception worthy of any chess grandmaster. What made him even more nervous, though, was Baldy sat in the driving seat behind the wheel. He didn't move, didn't blink, and hadn't said a word. Who the fuck was this guy? Whilst everyone else had chattered and joked around on the ride here up until a few moments ago, Baldy had remained silent, concentrating only on the road ahead. Knowles picked up his radio so he could speak to the guys in the other car, as well as the ones around him. "We're 1 minute from our target," he announced. "Alpha team with me, secure the front. Bravo team takes the back entrance." They usually do. Barnett, the youngest man in their team, quipped, earning a few guffaws of laughter from the others. "Our priority is Danny Dyson. He has to be extracted alive at all costs. Everyone else is secondary. His captors are armed and dangerous. Don't underestimate them. Sarah Connor and her accomplices are hostile," Baldy finally spoke. "They're to be terminated on sight." "What?" Knowles cast a sideways glance at the large Slafford driving the car. That was the first he'd heard about it. He leaned towards Baldy and spoke quietly in his ear. "Those aren't our orders," he said. "We're a rescue mission, not hit men." "We're to eliminate all hostiles," Baldy replied. "Anyone in the house who is not Danny Dyson is deemed hostile." "What are you, a fucking robot or something?" Knowles rolled his eyes and muttered quietly. Deemed hostile, this guy was a fucking joke. He knew he should have insisted on leading the team himself. "Just remember, I'm in command here," he said quietly. Baldy said nothing and continued driving. They rounded a corner and pulled up outside the target house. Before the car had even stopped moving, Knowles' door was open, and he was out on the pavement. A split second later, the team from his car bomb burst out of the back, followed up by Bravo team, which moved around to the back of the house. Knowles swallowed nervously and felt the hairs stick up on the back of his neck as a chill ran down his spine. He always got the same feeling before he went into combat, the tense nervousness soldiers the world over felt just before everything kicked off. He pushed it to the back of his mind and let the training and years of experience take over. He'd faced down Special Republican Guard in Gulf War, fought the Taliban in Afghanistan, and battled against insurgents in Fallujah in Operation Iraqi Freedom. After them, Sarah Connor and her accomplices hardly seemed like anything to be afraid of, he reminded himself. "Gas now." Knowles shouted to his team. One of the men smashed the window with the butt of his rifle and threw a gas grenade into the front room. They waited a few seconds for it to disperse, then Knowles kicked the front door open and threw in a flashbang, backing away for a second until the thing exploded in brilliant light and deafening, ear-splitting noise. He stormed into the house and swept his rifle across, searching for targets. There were none in sight. Nothing came to greet them, and there was no sign of Danny. The living room was completely empty. Living room's clear. Orson Jones, search upstairs. Barnett, with me. Knowles and Barnett passed through the living room and into the kitchen. The younger man kicked the door open, and the pair burst into the kitchen, Knowles aiming to the left and Barnett to the right. Again, there was nothing. 3 dirty dishes stood up on a rack on the sink, along with 3 forks and 3 glasses. At least we know how many of them we're up against now. Clear, Barnett shouted enthusiastically. Knowles had read Barnett's file from his employers when he'd picked the team. Only 26 years old and an ex-ranger. He'd had no idea at first why the man wasn't still serving, but Barnett had told him he'd had a friend who'd gone private and was earning more per day in Iraq than he'd done in a week in the Army, and it was all tax-free. Upstairs is clear, Orson's voice sounded on Knowles' radio. Where the fuck are they? Knowles growled. Baldy stepped through the front door and strode into the room, looking around and scanning his surroundings. They're not here, Knowles told him. It didn't matter, he realized. Danny had a tracking device implanted in him, and he'd been assured they could use it to find him practically anywhere on the planet, as long as they had satellites overhead. He pulled out the modified iPhone Coleman had given him and looked at the screen. According to this, he's right here, he said. The blip indicating Danny's location was right there, in the room with him. Give it to me, Baldy commanded. Knowles pushed the iPhone into his palm and already started to wonder what was going on here. He pressed on his radio to talk to all his men. Check for a basement and attic, he told them. Report back when you do. Don't try and go in alone. Wait for backup. He turned to Baldy. I think they're below us, he said. Shit. If that were the case, then they just lost the element of surprise. That could cost them dearly if Connor and Co. decided they weren't going to be taken alive. He stepped towards the front door and stood in the frame, thinking about his next move. If they found Connor and Danny in the basement or the attic, it would be a nightmare getting them out. Fighting their way down a staircase would be bad enough. If they were above them, it would be impossible. They weren't equipped to scale the roof and blast their way in from above. They'd have to level the building to get them out, and there was no way of doing that without killing Danny. Baldy stared intently at the iPhone and looked around the room. The screen indicated that Danny Dyson was exactly 3 feet in front of his position. In front of him was a black leather sofa, which he scanned thoroughly. He spotted a small blood stain on one of the cushions and stepped towards it. He lifted one of the cushions up to investigate. In a fraction of a second, Baldy's vision focused on a wire that became visible as he lifted the cushion up, connected to a small beige brick the size of a block of butter, and on top of the block was Danny Dyson's blood-stained tracking device. In a fraction of a second, the wire stretched out, tautened and pulled loose from the block. Kaboom! The sofa exploded outwards in an eruption of flame and threw Baldy back against the far wall of the living room. Further explosions rocked through the house a second later as more devices detonated and shook the foundations. Smoke billowed out as the sofa burned, and an alarm triggered from the ceiling, bleeping harshly as its sensors detected a fire. Knowles instinctively ducked as the blast rocked through the room. As it died down, he got up and started towards Baldy, reaching for the wound dressing he carried in the pouch on his vest. Medic! He shouted out at the top of his voice. One of Bravo team was their medical technician. Where the hell was he? Knowles heard wailing and screams emanating from other wounded men upstairs and started to move back into the house to help. He stopped cold as Baldy sat up, revealing a burnt, charred mess of pulped flesh and claret, and underneath it a metal skull with a glowing red orb where an eyeball used to be. What the fuck? Knowles stared with wide eyes and a slack, open jaw in disbelief at what he was seeing. You really are a robot. Baldy was a goddamn machine. All along, he'd been warned about cyborgs, and he'd been working with one this whole time. A red orb glowed from underneath the torn, squashed remains of an eyeball as Baldy stared at him, starting to slowly get back to his feet and reach for the gun that had been blown out of his grip. Fuck this. Knowles backed out of the front door and ran as fast as he could for the lead 4x4. He dived into the driver's seat, slammed the door shut as he slid in, and put the car into drive. Baldy emerged at the front door as he hit the gas. The wheels spun and screeched, kicking out a cloud of black smoke for a second until the tires gripped the tarmac, and Knowles tore down the road as fast as he could, daring to check the rear-view mirror for a split second to see Baldy growing smaller as he left the house in his dust. He kept his foot on the gas and drove quickly but carefully through the neighborhood, turning several corners to throw anyone who might be following off his tail. What the fuck was that thing? It was a damn cyborg, but what was it doing working for Kaliba? None of this made any sense, and he knew that too much adrenaline was coursing through his veins for him to think rationally, and he had to calm down before he tried to work out what the hell was going on, and then what the hell he was going to do about it all. 2 cars sped along the highway, a Mercedes and a Lexus, both black, and both heading nowhere in particular, just on the move, keeping mobile so they were harder targets to track. The Lexus took the lead. Savannah drove whilst Ellison was in the passenger seat, and her younger self sat quietly in the back, fast asleep with her head lolling to the side. In the trunk were their weapons and explosives. Ellison glanced sideways at Savannah once again for the umpteenth time, still getting his head around all this. It was so strange, having 2 Savannahs in the car at the same time, seeing exactly how the little girl in the back seat would like when she grew up. She'd be beating the boys off with a stick in years to come, he thought. The idea of it was a worry as well as a relief. He knew just what teenage boys and young men were like, but at the same time, at least she'd live long enough for all that. Are you going to say anything or just stare at me? Savannah asked, a slight grin on her face despite her words. She didn't mean it harshly at all. She could see his thinking, almost, and knew he was probably having a hard time making sense of all of it. It was strange for her, too, to see the man who'd been like a father to her for all those years alive, and well plus seeing herself in miniature in the back seat. I can't believe I had pigtails back then, she thought. It's all right, she told him. This is weird for me, too. Glad it's not just me then, he breathed out in relief, feeling the tension break between them. What happened in the future? He asked. I take it we didn't stop Judgment Day. That much was pretty clear, he figured. Otherwise, they'd have never got back. We didn't, Savannah said sadly. The whole thing went to shit. Without John, the machines won. How did you get involved in all this? Savannah breathed out as she recounted it all. After Sarah was killed, we fled south into Mexico. When the bombs went off, we stayed in hiding for years until John was due to arrive. We moved north of the border and set up camps in LA and searched for him. Eventually, we found him, unburied Cameron, and got her and John together again. What happened to Weaver and John Henry? Ellison asked. John Henry's part of Cameron now, she told him. Weaver. Savannah glanced behind her and made sure her mini-self was still asleep, not wanting her to hear about it. The liquid metal bought it just before we came back. She covered us, saved my life, actually. Savannah hadn't thought about it before, but she had to admit that without the T-1001, she would have died in Zierkorp. She felt seriously conflicted about that. She still hated the liquid metal bitch, but she'd also owed her life to it. Seeing as the machine was dead, she figured she could allow its stock to go up a notch in her book. That put it at notch 1. And me? Ellison asked. She hadn't mentioned him apart from them hiding in Mexico. Savannah clenched her jaw slightly and sniffled as she tried to block out the mental image of his death. It was no good. It played out before her mind's eye yet again, and she couldn't help it as a few teardrops rolled down her cheek as she turned her head away and concentrated on the road. Ellison saw the pained expression on her face, and it didn't take a genius to figure out what had happened to him. "Never mind," he said apologetically. "Do me a favor," Savannah said to him as she wiped the tears away from her eyes. "What is it?" he asked. She glanced back at her past self, sleeping soundly in the back seat. "Look after her," she said to him. "You're all she's got left." I don't know the first thing about raising kids," he said, realizing it probably sounded like he was making excuses. That wasn't it at all, but he was useless with children. He didn't know how to take care of a little girl. "Trust me," Savannah turned to him with a sad smile on her lips. "You'll be great." The Mercedes pulled up ahead of them, and John waved out the window to Savannah as they passed by and took the lead. She nodded back to him and watched as the car indicated right turning into the outside lane as they approached an exit ramp. She followed after them and took the same turning. She had no idea where the hell they were going. Sarah had just told them to head east, and she'd take the lead eventually. A safe house, Savannah supposed. Little Savannah stirred in the back seat, opened her eyes and stretched her arms out with a large, gaping yawn as she rejoined the land of the living. She looked out the window and saw the city whipping by as they sped along the road. "Where are we going?" she asked. Nobody had told her anything about what was happening, and she didn't know who the other lady in the car was. "Somewhere safe," Ellison said before the older Savannah could reply. He knew she would probably have said she didn't know, and the last thing the little girl needed was more uncertainty in her life. When they were through with all this, if they ever got through all this, and stopped Judgment Day, they'd have to sit down at some point and decide what they would do with little Savannah. "When can I see Mommy again?" Little Savannah asked, looking up at the two grown-ups with a hint of sadness in her eyes. "I want to go home." It was all Savannah could do to not tear up again at the thought of it all. She clenched her jaw and gripped the wheel tighter as she decided what to say. She checked the road ahead and saw it was fairly clear. It was straight, no intersections, and there was nothing ahead of them apart from the Mercedes in the next lane. She turned back in her seat to face her younger self. "Your mommy's dead," she said flatly. "She's not coming back." "I'm sorry." She turned forward again and watched the road. Little Savannah stared blankly for a moment, stunned as the words hit her. It took a few seconds for what was said to take effect, and when it did, it hit her like a sledgehammer. "Mommy." Tears filled her eyes and she sobbed loudly. A moment later, she leaned over to the side and buried her face in the seat beside her. Ellison turned and watched as she broke down in the back seat and started wailing, crying loudly and shaking as her sobs racked her body. He snapped his head at the Savannah driving and glared. "Why did you just say it like that?" he said, incredulous as to how callous the young woman was. Clearly, if he'd raised her in the future, he hadn't done a very good job. "She's just a kid. Show a little compassion." Savannah shook her head slowly, keeping her eyes on the road. She gestured for Ellison to lean in closer, not wanting her mini-self to hear what she had to say. Ellison understood and moved in towards her, craning his ear closer to her mouth. "She's better off thinking Weaver's dead," she replied simply. "Trust me on that one." He honestly had no idea what to say to that. Obviously, nobody knew Savannah like, well, Savannah. Ellison watched her features and saw a brief flash of anger mixed in with sadness. Clearly, the future Savannah was a troubled young woman, and he wondered how she'd come to learn the truth. It must have been seriously devastating for her to tell her past self her mom was dead, to spare her from further grief. What had happened to the sweet little girl in the back seat? He wondered. Somewhere along the line she'd hardened. She reminded him of Sarah, The two women would probably have a lot to talk about if they got together. He nodded to her, accepting she had a point. But still, she could have been a little more tactful about it. Nobody, especially a child, should have to hear about their parents like that. He wondered what had happened in the future to make her how she was. She leaned in towards him, this time, and spoke. "Promise me something. Don't ever tell her the truth." Her eyes bored down into his, and Ellison saw beyond the hardness, something softer and more vulnerable inside her, a hint of the scared little girl who right now was sobbing in the back seat. Weaver was clearly a weakness for future Savannah, a cause of major heartache he could see her trying desperately to forget. "I won't," he nodded. He then reclined his seat as far back as it would go, unbuckled his seatbelt, and slid into the back next to little Savannah, then sent the chair forward and wrapped his arms around her, pulling her into his embrace. He had no idea what to say to her. What could he say to a little girl who just found out her mom was dead? He settled for nothing at all, and just held her, softly stroking her hair and doing his best to comfort her. "I'll look after you," he thought. He caught the future Savannah's gaze in the rear-view mirror and nodded to her in silent agreement. Little Savannah would never know the truth. He decided he'd take care of her and make sure she never had to go through what her future self in the front seat had done, whatever it took. The two cars pulled up outside a small, single-story house in the desert, a few miles north of Big Bear. It was in the middle of nowhere, and their nearest neighbors were half a mile away. Sarah had checked it a while ago before deciding to lease it. The safe house was one she'd set up a while ago, the same one she'd sent Derek and Cameron to when she'd taken John to stay with Charlie at the lighthouse. Now it seemed it was finally going to be used. The Mercedes pulled to a stop first of all, followed by the Lexus a moment later. Before the Merc had even stopped moving, John flung open his door and stepped outside. "Mom, stay with Danny," he said as he moved to the back of the car. Cameron exited the driver's seat a moment after him and joined him at the rear as he opened the trunk to reveal their remaining weapons. He grabbed one of the HK-417s. He was so used to the weapon that it felt comforting in his hands, like an old friend being welcomed back, almost. He slotted a magazine into place and charged the rifle as Cameron picked out an AK and did the same. Savannah came up beside them and picked up the remaining HK-417, loaded and cocked it, and joined them. Sarah remained in the back seat with Danny and held her Glock firm. It went against every fiber of her being to sit in the rear, whilst John led from the front, but his tone as he'd spoken had been pretty clear. He'd given her an order and she'd been so shocked at it that she'd simply done as she was told. She kept a firm eye on the young man next to her, however, and Danny might have been convinced they were telling the truth, but she still didn't trust him. He'd have to earn it. John pointed his battle rifle forward and marched ahead, as did Cameron beside him. Savannah covered their approach as they moved and kept a keen eye out for anyone or anything that might jump out at them. They stopped a few feet away from the front door, and both of them watched the house for any signs of movement or recent activity. They needed to make sure the place hadn't been compromised. The wind breezed gently through the air and blew up small plumes of dust, but other than that, Cameron detected no signs of movement outside the house or within. She scanned the roof, but there were no snipers lying in wait, nor could she see anyone looking out of the windows. She switched to infrared tracking and made another sweep. Her sensors weren't 100% in the heat of the desert, so she couldn't be certain. The windows were all closed, and the temperature inside the room would likely exceed that of the human body, masking the signatures of anyone inside. In the future, she and other machines hadn't needed to worry about that, as the surrounding temperature was always low and body heat from a human was obvious. John stepped forwards and reached for the doorknob, but Cameron stopped him and held him just out of reach. "I'll go first," she said, her voice leaving John in no doubt that she wasn't going to argue about this. If the safe house had been booby-trapped, It was better if she triggered them rather than anyone else. He stepped back and kept his rifle raised as Cameron took out the key Sarah had given her, undid the lock, pushed the door open and stepped inside. There were no explosions, no eruptions of gunfire, and nothing attacked Cameron as she entered. She stepped further into the house and swung the gun around as she did a sweep of the main room. There was nothing inside, only an old three-piece suite and a coffee table in the living room. The door connecting to the kitchen at the back of the house was open, and she could see out the window at the rear wall. There was nothing there either. John and Savannah followed in after her, and the latter trained her rifle down the turning to the right of the living room, where the bedrooms and bathroom were located. "I'll check it out down here," she said, as she broke away from the main room. John followed after her into the small passage. "Take the ones on the right," he told her. "I'll check left." There were 2 doors on each side. John pushed one open with his foot and winced as the hinges creaked loudly. He thrust the weapon into the darkened room and saw nothing. He reached for the light and illuminated the room in a dim yellow glow, revealing a single bed made up to almost military precision. Mom's handiwork, he noted. Apart from the bed, the room was empty. "Mine are clear," Savannah called out. Jesus, that was fast, John thought. He quickly left the room and opened the other door. It was only a cupboard, and it was full to the brim of canned food. Tinned beans, meats, vegetables, meals in cans, condensed milk in cans, dried foods of every kind. There was MRE that he figured she must have bought from an army surplus store. He picked one up and read it. Teriyaki chicken, his mouth practically watered at the thought of it. "I'm having this one," he mumbled as he stuffed the silvery foil package into the large thigh pocket of his combat shorts. He'd save it for later. There were stacks of bottled water, sterilizing tablets, and all the paraphernalia associated with outdoor survival. "One thing about my mom," he commented to Savannah as she leaned over his shoulder and peered at the stacks of canned and dried foods. "She plans ahead." He didn't even know when she'd had time to put all this together. It must have been when he'd wasted months of his life seeing Riley, he thought with a pang of regret. Whilst he'd messed around and tried to run away from his life and his destiny, she'd constantly worked away tirelessly for him. As had Cameron. He decided he was going to make it up to both of them. He didn't know how, but he would. "It's all clear," Cameron called out. She went to the front door and nodded once to Sarah and Ellison. They took out Danny and little Savannah, locked up the cars and led them into the house. Once inside, they closed the door after them, sealing themselves inside from the dust blowing out gently across the flat, rocky desert. Sarah looked out the window at the cars outside. They stuck out like a bulldog's balls, but there was nothing they could do about it. There just wasn't anywhere they could hide them. "What's our next move?" Ellison asked as he sat little Savannah down on the couch and stared sullenly at the floor. The tide of tears had stemmed, but she'd been silent for the latter half of the trip and had just stared out the window. Danny walked over to an armchair and flopped down on it, noting how hard and scratchy it was, nothing like the plush furniture he'd furnished his own place with. He never got how people managed to rough it like this. "Don't get too comfy," John stared at him. He stood over Danny, still holding his gun in his hands, as were Savannah and Cameron, all looking menacing to the young man and suddenly making him feel very, very small in his chair. "What more do you want from me?" Danny asked, confused. He rubbed the bandage on his arm and winced in pain. He couldn't believe they'd cut him open like that, like a piece of meat. They might be the good guys, but they were goddamn savages. "A lot more," John said, leading the interrogation on his own. "Where's your AI? Where's Skynet?" Danny looked at John, the machine, and the redhead woman, all armed and all staring right at him. It was clear they meant business, and they wouldn't rest until they'd got what they wanted from him. What terrified him was that he didn't have it. "I don't know," he said. "Oh, come off it." Savannah rolled her eyes. Was that the best the kid could come up with? "You're trying to tell us," Sarah said, "that you worked on this thing for what, years, and you don't even know where it is." She shared the exact same sentiment as Savannah. The kid was full of shit. It would take a beating or two to get Danny to talk, she realized. It wouldn't take much. He didn't look particularly strong. A few slaps and he'd start singing like a canary. "I'm telling you the truth," Danny protested as he sank back into the chair, shrinking away from the trio in front of him. Sarah joined them to become four, intimidating him further. "Honestly, I never knew where we went. They picked us up from an airfield and flew us in a helicopter. Blacked out no windows in the back or anything. Took us out to the middle of nowhere, a mountain range somewhere." "Sierra Nevada mountains," Cameron replied. "That was an extremely large area to search. They'd be unlikely to ever find it. They'd fly us out, me and a team of computer scientists, engineers, and so on for shifts. 2 weeks on, 1 week back in the world. Nobody said a word about where we were going, not even the pilots." Cameron watched Danny carefully, observing every blink and twitch on his face and analyzing his expression and body language. She believed what he said. It would be logical for Kaliba to only provide what information was absolutely necessary for their unwitting employees to do their jobs. And she could tell by the way Danny looked up at her that he was afraid of her. She flashed him a smile, and he backed even further into his chair, his eyes widening slightly. She looked to John and Cameron, and they backed away. John crouched down again, so he was level with Danny, deciding to try and speak to him man to man rather than as a captor interrogating a prisoner. Savannah still stood with her weapon in her hands, clearly not caring that she was almost as scary as Cameron to the young man. "Danny," John said, keeping his voice even despite the desperation he felt to find out every last scrap of information they could use to stop Skynet. "What can you tell us about Kaliba?" Two men strolled side by side through an immaculate, almost sterile corridor. The passageway was surprisingly quiet considering just how busy the installation around them was. The corridor itself was like the calm eye in a storm of activity around them as scores of workers, engineers, scientists, computer programmers, and security personnel labored diligently and tirelessly. The two men were also hard at work, but to the untrained eye, it appeared they were simply chatting idly. They couldn't have been more different people. One was lean, fit, wore the dark blue uniform of the United States Air Force, holding his peaked cap under his arm and revealing a head full of short graying hair. The other was dressed in an expensively tailored gray suit, with pale blue silk shirt and a plain, darker blue tie, and had grown flabby and pasty after years of overindulgence in the new world granted to him. One was in the business of protecting his country, and the other was planning to destroy the world. Coleman led Colonel Skiff through the corridor and into a door on the right, emerging into a vast, cavernous hangar the size of a football pitch. It was easily the busiest part of the facility, with dozens of men and women working inside. Skiff's eyes widened as he took in the hangar and everything going on around him. "My God," he breathed, awestruck at the nearest machine to him. It was like nothing he'd ever seen before. It was a mass of sharp edges, angles, and constantly moving parts. Its wings, if that's what they were, never seemed to stay still for a moment. They constantly shifted and altered. It was sleek, angular, and looked almost alien. No wonder we've had so many crank calls about these California drones, Skiff thought. If he saw this thing out in the desert, he'd swear to God it was a UFO too. The constantly moving wings, engines, and other parts gave the aircraft an almost insect-like quality. In his mind's eye, he imagined a swarm of the aircraft protecting a giant hive somewhere. "What are these things?" he asked, unable to take his eyes off the things. "May I present to you," Coleman said proudly, sweeping his hand at the aircraft. "The XQ-84, we've nicknamed it the Dragonfly." He saw Skiff staring in confusion at the machines and decided to explain further. "They're designed from the ground up to operate with our AI, completely computer-controlled, capable of fully autonomous flight or remote piloted by Skynet." Coleman smiled with a sense of pride at the sleek UCAVs in the hangar. Unlike the crude drone aircraft they'd used to kill Catherine Weaver with, these versions had been refined, improved upon, and turned into combat-capable killing machines. They were much larger, 3 times the length of the prototype, more solidly built, and they'd removed the third engine offset from the front of the fuselage and replaced it with a much smaller one in the center of the body, concealed by ports on the back and belly of the aircraft that would open when it needed to hover. "This is all a bit much," Skiff replied, taken aback at the scale of Kaliba's operations. Coleman shrugged it off. "We want to prove to you just how effective our AI really is. Are you planning to include these aircraft into Exercise Blue Star?" the colonel asked. He counted at least a dozen of the strange, futuristic-looking drones and wondered how the hell they'd even came up with such a thing. He'd never, ever seen an aircraft like it before, and he was curious to see how the things would operate on the battlefield. Blue Star was a planned military exercise that would simulate a miniature war in the Mojave Desert between the Army's 4th Infantry Division and the 1st Marine Expeditionary Force, the former operating with air support from the Air Force and the latter relying on their own AV-8B Harriers. Skynet would coordinate the Marines against the Army's efforts. If the Marines won, then Colonel Skiff would recommend the contract be awarded to Kaliba, and their AI adopted to coordinate the entire military. It was the largest game of chess ever played, man versus machine. "Only if you want them to be," Coleman replied, suppressing a grin at Skiff's reaction. "But Harriers against F/A-22s doesn't seem like a fair fight to me." That should get him interested, he thought. The colonel stepped closer to the nearest Dragonfly and reached out to touch it, the narrow, thin wingtip protruding outward from the circular engine nacelle, but hesitated just before his fingers made contact. It looked far too skinny to be a wing. It was more like a helicopter's rotary blade in width. Suddenly, the wings split down the middle and opened outward, like a pair of scissor blades separating. "Jesus!" Skiff snapped his hand back away from the thing as his heart skipped a beat. What the hell was that? One of the engineers stepped towards him and nodded a greeting. Variable geometry scissor wingtips. They close up together to reduce drag in flight and open to help slow it down when it needs to. "Colonel," Coleman gave out a slight grin as he turned to the officer. "How would you like a demonstration?" "Of course," Skiff nodded. This thing was so strange, so alien, and it had captivated his attention. He wanted to see if its flying was as different as its appearance. "Activate units 4 through 7, Coleman said to the engineer. A shrill beeping sounded, and his pocket vibrated. "One moment." He excused himself from the engineer and the colonel and stepped away as he pulled his cell phone out and flipped it open. The caller ID revealed the T-888's number. "Yes?" he asked, hoping to hear the good news. The house was empty. Baldy's monotonous, emotionless voice answered him. Sarah Connor and her associates still have Danny Dyson. They were expecting us. They prepared a trap. Knowles has disappeared. He's aware I'm a machine. He could be a threat to the project. Shit, Coleman cursed under his breath. I've neutralized the remaining members of his team to prevent security leaks. Mobilize the other teams. Knowles has to be found. Immediately. Understood, he replied. A second later, the phone hung up, and the conversation was over. Coleman sighed at the orders he'd been given. He and the others might be the ones running the business, wearing the expensive Italian suits, driving the fancy cars and living in luxury, enjoying all the benefits the past had to offer. But it was the two machines who were really in charge. "I have matters to attend to," Coleman said to Colonel Skiff with a hint of regret. He'd actually looked forward to showing off their machines to the officer, seeing the look on his face as he watched them in action. He decided he'd book himself a front-row seat to observe Blue Star instead, where all the top brass and the defense secretary would be there to witness the birth of the Skynet defense system. "I'll leave you with Mr. Matthews, here." He gestured to the engineer, who'd explained the Sisser wings to the colonel. "He'll talk you through all the technical specifications." "It's been good seeing you again, Colonel." He hurriedly marched back out of the hangar space and into the complex proper, back through the sterile, windowless corridors, and towards the meeting room where he and the other Greys held their conferences. He burst through the door and saw the massive, hulking form of the other machine, a T-800. Unlike the bald one standing there with its arms by its sides facing Coleman as he entered, almost as if expecting him. "We need to mobilize all teams," Steroids said as Coleman closed the door behind him. "Sergeant Knowles is a threat. He has to be eliminated." "You don't need to tell me that," Coleman snapped irritably. The machines could be so dense sometimes. Sarah Connor's still at large. She still has Danny Dyson, and now Knowles has disappeared. If those three start working together, then everything we've worked for these past few years will be in jeopardy. We might have had a better chance of finding them if your little brother hadn't have wiped out the entire team. The agency won't keep providing men if you keep killing them." The T-800 replied without a moment's hesitation. "Double their contract," it said flatly. "Skynet's monitoring all CCTV cameras in the city. It will find Sarah Connor. Mobilize the other teams to find Knowles. Apprehend his family and make him come to us." Terse silence filled the small living room of the safe house, and 5 pairs of eyes stared, almost unblinking and in disbelief, at Danny. Sarah shook her head, part denial, part disgust, as everything he'd said sank in. HK prototypes, mercenaries, and a military contract, that's all but signed. Jesus. What did they have? Half a dozen of them, and the only one she could really depend on was herself. She still didn't trust Cameron, and after leading her son to the future, the machine had a long, long way to go before she'd ever think about putting any faith in her again. She didn't know this other, adult Savannah, and couldn't make any assumptions about her. Ellison. She'd learnt now to trust him, but he wasn't a soldier, and even though he'd handled himself well in the raid on Zyracorp, that was completely different to storming a Kaliba fortress out in the desert. She figured she could count on Danny even less than she could Cameron. At least the tin Miss could fight, and as for John. She looked at her son as he unself-consciously pulled off the t-shirt he'd been wearing all this time and took out a clean gray one from the closet. He'd already changed into a pair of cargo pants and slipped some boots on. She could see the changes in John. He was leaner, harder. He looked like he'd been through a war, and his eyes held a similar wary glint she'd seen in Kyle's. The look of someone who'd lived through hell and come back to tell the tale. She could see it in Savannah, too. What happened to him? She asked herself, not sure if she wanted to know as she saw a look pass between him and Cameron when the former handed the latter some better-suited clothes for her to change into. It was faint, but she picked it up. Nothing overt, but their eyes met for a fraction of a second longer than was necessary, and a very slight upturning of the lips that was so infinitesimal most people would probably think they imagined it. Something had happened between them in the future, and she knew it. She knew her son, and knew he'd gone after her for a good reason, at least in his mind, and he wasn't evasive around her like he'd been before. She wanted to trust John. She had faith in his abilities. He'd survived the future, found Cameron, and made it back with an ally his capabilities and skills weren't in any doubt at all. He'd clearly proved simply by making it back alive that he was clever, tough, and resourceful. But he had one weakness. Cameron. She didn't know yet whether she could count on him. She wanted to. Fuck em, Savannah shrugged. Language, Ellison admonished her, putting his hand on the younger Savannah's shoulder. He knelt down to her and looked squarely into her eyes. Don't ever say that word, okay? He said, softly but sternly. "Kay," little Savannah nodded. Daddy had never liked swearing anyway. What shocked Ellison is that the older redhead blushed slightly and looked away at his comment. Sorry, Savannah said sheepishly. Was she embarrassed? He wondered. The young woman seemed to have a bit of an attitude, but she just complied without hesitation to him, like a naughty child being told off by her parents. He had the feeling if Sarah had told her off like he had, it wouldn't have worked. Savannah's reply would have consisted of 2 words, the second one being off. We've got guns and we've got Cameron, Savannah continued. We can find the place, storm it and kick the craw. She stopped mid-sentence and looked at Ellison and her younger self. We can stop them, she corrected herself, earning a grateful nod from her future surrogate father for not swearing in front of her miniature self. We don't know how to find them, John shook his head, disappointed. We don't have any more leads. There's one, Danny supplied, seeing his chance to be useful. The helicopter I told you about. I'd recognize it anywhere. That's something, John nodded. At the very least, if it came down to it, they could hijack it and force the pilot to fly them there. Though after what Danny said about those HK drones, he didn't much like the chances of making it there in one piece. An idea struck Sarah, and her mind flashed back to the night they'd infiltrated Zyracorp and extracted Danny. She remembered the mercenary she'd knocked out. Andrew Knowles, she said to Ellison. Who? He looked at her, confused as he tried to recall who that was. He couldn't remember, and wondered what Sarah was thinking. She was so unpredictable, probably, why she'd been so hard to catch, that it was hard to keep up with her. The merc we beat up, she explained. He worked for Kaliba. He's gotta exist somewhere, right? The former agent smiled. First a slight upturning of the lips, then it grew into a full beam revealing his white teeth as he caught onto what Sarah was getting at. They had a name. They just had to put an ID to it and follow the paper trail. I could search for him, Cameron offered. We don't have a computer or internet here, Sarah replied. The idea was to stay off the radar, not have postmen wandering over with bills. There wasn't even any electricity apart from the gas generator outside. I don't need one, Cameron said with a slight smile. She could sift through more data in a second than they could if they sat at a laptop for a year. No, John shook his head at her. If Skynet's up and running, and it hacked into John Henry before, it'll find you, he said to Cameron. They don't know where we are, he went on. That's our advantage for now. Cameron was their ace in the hole. As far as Skynet and Kaliba knew now, John Henry was dead, Weaver was dead. They didn't know that Cameron, as she was now, even existed. From Kaliba's point of view, the threat from rival AI was gone. We can't leave a paper trail, Ellison finished off his thoughts. He'd seen plenty of criminals and terrorists do the same over the years. Adopt more old-fashioned, more secure methods of communication and record-keeping, making sure they couldn't be traced. How do we do that? Danny asked. Ellison looked over to Sarah as an idea or a person more accurately came to mind. Malenkov, he said. Malenkov always knew everything that was going on, and if he didn't, he could find out, quickly and discreetly for a price, of course. Malenkov, Sarah nodded. Little Savannah stared at Sarah and Ellison in confusion. What's a Malenkov?